welcome to the program. I'm Mike Leiderman. Jonathan Kaufman writes for the Boston Globe. He won a Pulitzer Prize before he was 30 on the subject of racism and job discrimination in Boston. He writes now of the broken alliance, the turbulent times between blacks and Jews in America. That's his new book on a topic that, especially in this city, has piqued a great deal of interest for all the friction that has developed between both blacks and Jews. It is the subject that has been addressed often, several times on this program and in all the media, radio, TV, print, in public meetings, family dinners, family feuds, arguments among friends, every form imaginable, it seems, and usually with little resolved and with a tremendous buildup of frustration and anger. Jonathan, it is good to have you with us.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
The book has already created quite a bit of stir. You've been on the talk show circuit as well. For this particular discussion that you and I are going to have, I really didn't want to have representatives, if you will, from both sides all the time. I'd just like to talk to you as the reporter in this piece, albeit a Jewish reporter, and what inspired you to do it, what your findings were, because a lot of the book, although you are from Boston, grew up in New York, and you have a national focus to this, centers around Chicago. Why?
Well, let me tell you a little bit about how I got interested. I really became interested in this topic about 4 years ago when Louis Farrakhan came to the Boston Globe, where I work as a reporter, and met with a group of reporters and editors. He didn't say anything that was different than what he'd said publicly, but soon after he left, all the black and Jewish reporters started screaming at each other. And it was very personal.
That really threw you, didn't it?
Well, it did, because I'd grown up taking black-Jewish cooperation for granted, but suddenly there I was in the newsroom, and a Jewish reporter was saying that his brother hadn't gotten into law school because of affirmative action, and a black intern was saying to me that Jews control the press and the banks. So I decided to sort of go around the country and in a journey, in a way, to sort of see what it was that brought these groups together and what split them apart, focusing on the lives of real people. What brought me to Chicago was a story about a family named the Epsteins, Roz and Bernie Epstein, who I think epitomized a tremendous change that took place in the late 1960s, one that hasn't been written about very much, and that's the change in neighborhoods, neighborhoods that changed from largely Jewish neighborhoods to black neighborhoods. So it was really their story and what happened to them and their kids that brought me here. Although, of course, recently with all the controversy over Steve Coakley and so on, a lot of the political
currents. Well, it's more than that. It also goes back to Marquette Park, the Democratic Convention. Right. It seems that all the breaking in the broken alliance can be symbolized by what was going on in 1968 at the Democratic Convention and things that were happening.
I think that's true. I think when we talk about black-Jewish relations, we tend to focus a lot on the more current things like Jesse Jackson and Ed Koch's remarks in the New York primary and Louis Farrakhan and so forth. But I think the roots of this break, and in many ways the first rupture, really takes place in the late 60s. I think the Democratic Convention is part of it. I think the rise of black power is part of it. The Ocean Hill-Brownsville school strike, which I devote a whole chapter to and focus on Rhodey McCoy, the black head of the school district there, a strike that exploded into charges of Jewish racism and black anti-Semitism. And also the Six-Day War. I think one of the things we tend to forget is the Six-Day War in 1967 had a dramatic effect not only on how American Jews saw Israel, but I think how they saw themselves and how their priorities changed. One of the key characters in the book is Marty Peretz, the editor of the New Republic, someone who was very deeply involved in civil rights. But after 67, like many Jews, begins to become more and more concerned with Israel and pushes that to the top of his agenda.
Let's go back a bit. You really start with Paul Parks,
right,
who is one of the first, a black man, first to liberate Dachau with the American forces, has made several trips to Israel, and really is the heart of the love that exists between some Jews and some blacks. And I'm very carefully choosing that expression. This all grew in the 40s and 50s as Brown versus Board of Education was coming up. Where was the fusion between blacks and Jews, and was it, how much of an alliance was it? And what brought these two groups together as opposed to blacks and Poles, blacks and Irish, and other ethnic groups where the neighborhoods scattered?
One of the things I discovered when I went back is that even though we have sort of this wonderful memory of a great romantic and idealistic period of the early 60s, which it certainly was, blacks and Jews were really brought together by a lot of self-interest. It was almost intersecting agendas. You know, when Paul Parks, as a black soldier, walks into Dachau and sees the Jews stumbling out of the barracks, he asks a rabbi why those people are there. And the rabbi says, well, there's no reason why they're here. They were just here because they're Jews. And Parks's reaction is to sit down on the ground and say, well, I understand that because I've seen people lynched just because they're black. I think in that moment, you see much of what it was that brought blacks and Jews together. America in the 1950s, we tend to forget this maybe, was still a very hard country for Jews. There was still anti-Semitism, there was still bigotry, discrimination, quotas, neighborhoods and houses that Jews could not move into, jobs they couldn't get, and so on. So the civil rights movement, with its promise of knocking down the barriers of bigotry, of opening up the society, was good for blacks, but it was also good for Jews. And I think Jews recognized that. They knew that as these barriers came down, it would be good for them as well as blacks. Blacks, for their part, I mean, there have always been, I think, two strains in the black community in terms of dealing with whites. There have been the more nationalistic blacks, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, who have said we have to do it on our own, even separatists. But there's also been what I would call a cosmopolitan strain, or an integrationist strain, which has said, you know, we have to work with the white community. Now, for reasons I think internal to the black community after the Second World War, that cosmopolitan strain comes to the fore. Clearly, Martin Luther King epitomizes that. And if you're looking for white allies, Jews are good allies. And so I think that, in a sense, both groups understand that they have a vested interest in the success of the civil rights movement, and that's why they're there.
Because Jews would benefit and blacks would benefit.
Exactly.
As you say in the book, the two agendas intersect.
Yes. Yes.
Also, you see that there is a history that you point out at the beginning,
right,
where wealthy Jews, several wealthy Jews, founded, for example, the Rosenwald schools, founded by the man who created Sears, that were specifically targeted to blacks. The head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the first couple were all Jews.
Right.
So here was an opportunity for Jews then to say, why? Because we have a social conscience, we are doing something for blacks, and the blacks are saying, well, we can use this to help ourselves. What happened after that, though? Is it the fact that the blacks resented the Jews running things, and that the blacks wanted to assume power, which, you know, we're working for ourselves, we certainly should have a say?
Right.
Is that what the break?
I think that's part of it. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that when I talk to Jews about this subject, they tend to get very nostalgic about that period of cooperation, remember, you know, black and white together and all that. Blacks, by and large, are not very nostalgic about that period, in part because I think they resented what they saw as a certain kind of paternalism that hovered over those early encounters, the sense that Jews, as Paul Parks called them, were the list makers. They were the ones who were behind the scenes, you know, very involved in the organizational thing.
Not showing us how to do it, but doing it for us.
In some ways. But I think, and what's interesting is in the late 1960s, when black power begins to arise, and you have blacks saying, we want to control our own organizations, we want to sort of run things ourselves. In talking to blacks for Broken Alliance, what was most striking in a way was that many blacks thought that Jews, of all people, would understand that Jews would understand the importance of running your own organization, of controlling your destiny, and were surprised when many Jews really took it very personally. Jews were so involved in civil rights. I mean, I think it's extraordinary. 3/4 of the contributions that went to Martin Luther King came from Jewish contributors. Jews made up 2/3 to 3/4 of the people who went down south for the freedom rides and so on. I mean, chances are when you looked at a civil rights leader in the 1960s, that they had a Jewish speechwriter or a Jewish fundraiser. Many of their supporters,
and
their
Cheney,
white supporters,
Goodman,
were
and
Jews.
Schwerner, 2 of the 3 who were murdered, were of course
3 civil rights workers, 2 Jews and a black. But when black power comes along and begins to ease whites out, many of those whites are Jews, and Jews take it very badly. And they feel that somehow that blacks are no longer interested. What's interesting is that Jack Greenberg, who's another person I profile in the book, who was head of the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP for 25 years, when he was first named to succeed Thurgood Marshall in 1962, one of the comments that a black lawyer makes is, well, where's the black person heading the Anti-Defamation League? And I think in a way we see there how blacks and Jews saw the same events through very different lenses. Jews thought they were participating and helping, but many blacks, I think especially in the late 1960s, began to say, wait a second, whose movement is this anyway? And we want to have some more control.
But how do you go from there to the friction, to the, if you will, the hatred that has, the word is not blossomed, but has erupted as a result of this? It's one thing to have differences. It's one thing to deal with power and control. It's quite another thing to deal with a personal race or ethnic hate situation that many blacks and Jews find themselves involved in.
Well, I think a couple of things happen. One is I think that the interests of the two groups begin to diverge dramatically. The interest that sort of created almost a natural alliance in the late 50s and early 60s really go in different areas. I mean, issues like affirmative action, Israel, and campaign of Jesse Jackson. Those are key issues to both sides, and they both have very strong opinions.
Go back to Israel for a minute, if I may stop you, Jonathan, because you make the point in the book that's very well taken, that the rise of Israel and the concern of the Jewish mind here in America,
right,
in the opinion of blacks and the opinion of Jews, supplanted the civil rights movement after the Six-Day War.
Well, I think that's true. I think one of the things that you see, I mean, there was some polling data I sort of excavated, studies that were actually done of Highland Park, right outside Chicago, where back in the 1950s, pollsters went out and said, what does it mean to be a good Jew? And the answers they got in the 1950s were things like supporting civil rights, being involved in civic causes. Israel was about 10th on the list. After 1967, of course, they do similar surveys, and Israel is number 1 on the list. And not only Israel, but also questions of Jewish identity, questions of Jewish studies. I mean, one of the great ironies of the civil rights movement is that the growth of black power and black consciousness opens up the way to make all ethnic groups more conscious.
Absolutely.
I mean, if black is beautiful, then Jewish can be beautiful. And after the '67 war, you see a tremendous explosion of interest in Jewish studies and so on. And I think that Israel does become clearly the centerpiece of Jewish concern. And many blacks sort of resent that. I mean, their struggle is still continuing, and they suddenly see, Jewish energies being diverted into other areas. But when you're asking about sort of what led to the hatred, I think one of the things that led to the hatred were higher expectations. Most blacks I spoke to for Broken Alliance, and I think this is true across the board, never expected much from white people. They knew how whites felt about blacks, but they thought Jews were different, and they expected more from them. The commitment Jews had shown in founding the NAACP and working with blacks through civil rights really rubbed off. And so I think many blacks were surprised when Jews began to peel away from the movement, when in Ocean Hill-Brownsville you had Jewish teachers opposing a struggle for black control, when you had Jewish intellectuals around commentary and so on, criticizing the black cause.
In Ocean Hill-Brownsville, let's go back to this for those who are not familiar with it. This was a school district in New York where they were decentralizing the schools, where it was basically an all-black district, and most of the teachers, as were most of the major inner-city school systems, were heavily white and heavily Jewish.
Yes.
So the issue for the blacks was control of their own educational process.
Right.
And for the Jewish people there, it was, hey, this is our parnassa, this is our livelihood that you want to take away from us. We have the tenured positions, we've given our lives. Some of us are very good at what we do, some of us are less competent, but all of us are here with our jobs, and now you're pushing us out.
Right.
This leads to friction, but from there it's sprung into a more personal, more ethnic, anti-black, anti-Semitic confrontation.
Right. And I think that in a way it sort of was almost a dress rehearsal. This occurred in 1968. I think it was a dress rehearsal for what would happen increasingly in the 70s, because suddenly blacks found that their opponents, as they were trying to move ahead, were not bigoted white Southerners or Southern sheriffs with potbellies and attack dogs, but in this case, Jewish liberals, many of whom have been very committed to civil rights. And I think what's so tragic about the Ocean Hill-Brownsville situation was the way it exploded into these vicious charges of anti-Semitism and racism. And really, New York has never recovered from that. And I don't think black-Jewish relations really has recovered as well.
Are you saying that the Jews were tolerant until it hit them in the pocketbook?
I think there's an element of that. I mean, I think, Jews clearly, like many liberal whites, suddenly had to sort of face their idealism challenged by reality, and I think it would be naive to assume that Jews didn't respond that way. I also think, though, that many Jews began to get very uneasy in the late 1960s, when after the Six-Day War, for example, SNCC and the Black Panthers issue violently anti-Zionist and in most cases anti-Semitic statements. And many Jews sort of say, wait a second, is this what civil rights leads to? We were part of a struggle that we thought was going to open up the country and make it more tolerant. Now suddenly we hear black power and people demanding our jobs and people attacking Israel. This isn't quite what we bargained for when we started marching in the early 1960s.
But isn't it also interesting that, as you said before, and I've heard Paul Parks say this, and you write about it in the book, that the black expected more from the Jew. The Jews, or a lot of Jews I know, would find that extremely arrogant. They would say, well, we did more. How dare you expect us to give more than we give, if in fact we are giving as opposed to working together? Aren't you black people turning on Jews as the rest of history has turned on Jews. Once you got what you want, you make us the scapegoats.
Right. I must say, you know, I think those comments are quite accurate, and I hear them all the time, and that's one of the reasons why, you know, in the final section of my book, I focused on people I sort of call the generation too young to have marched with Martin Luther King. Because I think in some ways, the experiences of the 60s scarred both sides so much that it really will fall to this younger generation of blacks and Jews in their 20s and 30s to sort of see if an alliance can be brought back together. One of the people I focus on in the book is Donna Brazile, a young black woman who achieved a lot of attention recently when she had to resign from the Dukakis campaign before the election because of comments she made about George Bush's private life, but I also think more accurately of some comments she made about the Bush campaign using Willie Horton and racist code words. Well, Donna Brazile, you know, was never part of that grand alliance, and in some ways, her attitude, I think, is far healthier. Her attitude is, I believe in coalitions, I believe in alliances, but I have to do also what's best for black people. Well, I hear younger Jews saying the same thing, which is, you know, I was down at Yale, for example, recently giving a speech, and a young Jewish student came up to me and said, well, you know, I hear about all this Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman business, but the only way I know blacks is through affirmative action, and it's going to be harder for me to try to go to law school. Well, I think one of the things younger blacks and Jews have to do is to figure out, without all the expectations, how can they really help each other? In other words, realistically in the Democratic Party or in Chicago or elsewhere, how can blacks and Jews find that common agenda? Because sometimes, I mean, it feels to me as if blacks and Jews, it's almost like they're fighting in an arena, and they're so good fighting each other, they sometimes forget who's in the grandstand. They sometimes forget who's watching.
And there's a feeling that says, okay, both you guys kill yourselves
Exactly.
off.
The people in the grandstand are very often people who don't like blacks, they don't like Jews. They love it when blacks and Jews fight with each other. And I think at some point blacks and Jews have to ask themselves, well, who really benefits from this?
But there's also a feeling among Jewish groups especially that there's a tremendous amount of power in the black leadership now. They know Jesse Jackson, whatever his motives are, is above all a person of the media. He knows how to use television. He knows how to motivate a group. He knows how to rhyme. He knows how to get something going. The Jews don't have that kind of fusion. Farrakhan, for all his bile that he spills out that offends many blacks,
Right.
still is one of these guys who's eminently quotable on the 6 o'clock news.
Right.
The only Jewish, and I don't want to say equivalent, but the only person with that kind of goal is Meir Kahane, who is absolutely, if you will, ignored or what's the word I'm looking for? Repudiated by nearly everyone in the Jewish world. So, you know, there's no real concerned, visible Jewish leadership. The black leadership threatens the Jews in many cases, the more public ones, the Jesse Jacksons and the Farrakhans, and that worries people. And what does that say for any kind of rapprochement?
Well, no, I think it's true. It's a real problem. I think that, I mean, I would argue that Jesse Jackson is far more than a media figure. I mean, I think he is the embodiment of black political aspirations right now. And I think
might get a big argument here in Chicago.
Well, you might, but I think that what he showed in the primaries is clearly
that he
is a leading political figure. And I think while many Jews do not like him and do not like what he represents, he clearly is going to be a tremendous power in the Democratic Party in the years to come. And I would argue, we've long talked about Jesse Jackson's Jewish problem, the fact that Jews won't vote for him. Well, Jews now have a Jesse Jackson problem, which is how do you deal with someone who is going to be basically the head of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, who, as you quite rightly say, Jews are very suspicious of. Well, a couple of things. I think that the fact that Jackson and Farrakhan get so much attention, we also have to pay attention to the fact there are a lot of local black political leaders. Bill Gray in Philadelphia, the congressman, black congressman there, Mickey Leland in Texas, Wilson Good, the mayor of Philadelphia, John Lewis, the congressman down in Atlanta, Willie Brown, a very powerful black politician in California, who at the local level are working very hard, I think, to bring blacks and Jews together because politically and pragmatically they know they need that coalition. I think one of the tragedies here in Chicago is that there doesn't appear to be that kind of leadership. It seems that for, you know, Harold Washington, I think, was a brilliant politician, was able to both secure his black base, serve that community, deliver for them,
and get elected by the lakefront,
and yet also send the messages to Jews who are also part of that coalition that reassured them, that showed he was sensitive to their concerns by going to Jerusalem and so forth. I think with Washington's death, I mean, Chicago has really struggling now, I mean, clearly politically to find out who will succeed him. And I think that one of the things Chicago is missing now are the sort of politicians who say, wait a second, this many votes and this many votes, how do I get a coalition going to make it work together? And that's something I think that in a way is maybe out of the hands of both blacks and Jews. You know, you can't always choose who your leaders are. I also feel that one of the things about Jackson is that as hard as it's going to be, I think Jackson and Jewish groups are going to have to come to some accommodation, because if not, they're going to tear the Democratic Party apart. It's clear that Jackson intends to run again in 1992. It's clear that he wants to be a player, one of the people at the table. Jews are going to have to figure out how to deal with that, and Jackson with them. I mean, someone said recently, I think it's a very interesting comment, that Hymietown was Jesse Jackson's Chappaquiddick, you know, the reason why he will never become president. This issue is often talked about as sort of a family squabble, yet it ends up having ramifications, you know, all throughout American politics and American life. And I think that unless blacks and Jews are able to somehow come to some, if not reconciliation, at least some honest conversation, which I'm hoping my book is provoking, I think the Democratic Party is going to be severely weakened.
Is Chicago similar to what's going on nationally, or is it more intense? My feeling is it's much more intense here, and the frictions are much greater here than they are just about everywhere else.
I think that's true. I think in a sense what it shows is that this whole black-Jewish dynamic has been laying beneath the surface for at least 20 years. And so I think what you get are explosions of it. We had one in New York, clearly, in the past primary, when Koch said Jews would be crazy to vote for Jesse Jackson. We had it here with Coakley. I think Los Angeles now is going to have a similar problem, because you have Tom Bradley, who is a black mayor who's long been elected with Jewish support, Jewish contributions, being challenged by a Jewish city councilor. And I think the issue is going to bubble up. I think, I must say, we normally, I think in the past, thought of New York as being sort of the center of this controversy. I think in the recent year, it has really shifted to Chicago, in part because I think many Jews were terrified, not so much by what Coakley said, because there are always people who say crazy things, but by what they felt was the failure of black leaders, responsible black leaders, to speak out against him. And I must say, as I speak to Jewish groups around the country for Broken Alliance, one of the things I hear over and over again is a real fear among Jews of black anti-Semitism. I think if you ask most Jews these days, where is the danger of anti-Semitism, they'll say in the black community. I have some problems with that. I don't think it's precisely true. I think we have to draw a careful distinction between blacks who are anti-Semitic, which I think is a small segment, and blacks who I think are hostile to Jews because they perceive that Jews are hostile to their interests. I mean, you can be a black on the south side of Chicago and know that, you know, Jews are on the other side of affirmative action, disagree about Middle Eastern policy, are very hostile to Jesse Jackson, and then because of this whole tangled history that blacks and Jews have, say, I don't like Jews. That's different from anti-Semitism, and I think we've got to be aware of that.
But isn't it more basic than that? And it's because so many blacks have moved into what had previously been Jewish neighborhoods. It's a very personal thing. This storekeeper cheated me.
Right.
This black mugged me. Jackie Mason, who I always go back to as a scion of American social conscience, said something you never heard four black people walk into a Jewish neighborhood and say, look out, there's a Jew over there, I'm scared.
Right.
You know, as opposed to the other way around.
Right.
I mean, aren't these more basic fear things?
That's an element of it. And in fact, the reason, you know, I focus on Chicago for that story of the change of Marionette Manor on the far south side.
Let's talk about that a bit, because the people you talk about, Roz and Bernie Epstein, are from Chicago.
Right.
They were I guess the golden liberals. These are the people who had
people
nothing but pure hearts.
The people who made you believe that Jews were truly allergic to injustice.
Right. As Paul Parks did on the black side.
And I think what happened to the Epsteins was that they marched with Martin Luther King in 1966. They were committed to live in an integrated Jewish neighborhood, that their kids would be brought up in an integrated Jewish neighborhood, an integrated neighborhood. And what they found, though, is that more blacks began to move into the far south side, into Marionette Manor and the areas around it. A lot of the Jews left. The streets became less safe. Schools became worse. Their synagogue closed down. Their Jewish community center closed down. And I think in a way, in one of the most poignant moments, their eldest son confronts them after having been beaten up at a hockey game and says, you know, Mom and Dad, you believe all this integration stuff, but I'm living it. And, you know, the reviews of the book have focused on that story, I think, as being in a way the most tragic, because the Epsteins in the end moved to the suburbs. And the fact that people who were so committed still felt overwhelmed by the forces of the city and the forces of the 60s that they had to move, I think, is sad. The thing that I think is important to remember, though, is that the Epsteins are still very committed. I mean, they're still quite liberal. They still devote large parts of their lives to, you know, to work that you know, helps blacks, and teachers and so on. But I think they share, along with a lot of other Jews, a sense that somehow things went wrong. Things didn't turn out the way they were supposed to. And I think that that sadness and some of the anger that some of their friends have about that time is something that has really persisted. On the black side, I think you're right, that there is clearly a sense among many blacks. When I speak to black and Jewish groups, it's almost like speaking at a fundamentalist church. People stand up and they testify. And you know, and
always.
I was in.
They don't ask questions; they make comments.
And you know, and even here in Chicago, people do that. You know, a black person will stand up and say, "Well, you know, I always thought Jews were good because of the Exodus story, and I heard about it in church, and I knew about Moses, and that was a very powerful image for me. But it was also true that my mother and my aunt worked in Jewish homes all the time I was growing up, and that bothered me. I saw that as a slave relationship, which of course it wasn't. But those personal encounters, I think, you know, really stay with people. It's one thing to argue about politics, but when you get into how you were treated or how your family was treated, that sticks in.
Is that the bottom line? If there is to be a unity, somewhat of an alliance that is not based on mutual need anymore, is there any need for it? And will it be successful, or will it be destroyed, not by so much the politics, but by the personal?
Well, my feeling is that I think there's a need, because I always focus on those people in the grandstand. And I think that we have to remember, with the rise of the skinheads and the Aryan Nation and all those people, there are a lot of people out there who don't like blacks and they don't like Jews. I also think, though, that you're right. One of the things blacks and Jews have to do is to start talking to each other again. There are two groups who think they know everything about the other side, but in fact know very little. And I guess if I had a hope for Broken Alliance, it's that it would start blacks and Jews to sort of say, let's talk about what's really eating at us. Let's talk about Israel's ties to South Africa. Let's talk about Farrakhan. Let's talk about these things. Because once you begin to talk, it may not be a solution, but it begins to open the way for people to figure out where the common ground may lie.
That's swallowing a lot of pride and risking a lot of fear, isn't it?
It is, but you know, in the end, what's the alternative? I mean, I think that both blacks and Jews have a real stake in this country that is open and tolerant and diverse. I still believe that. And I think it's not just abstract, woolly idealism. I think that if this country swings to the right, as someone here in Chicago said to me recently, you know, blacks and Jews may not have come in the same boat, but they'll be leaving soon after each other.
Fast half hour. Jonathan Kaufman, thanks so much.
Thank you.
The book is Broken Alliance, Turbulent Times Between Blacks and Jews in America. Our guest, the author, Jonathan Kaufman, and I certainly hope it has started people talking. I hope this half hour has done that too.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Mike Leiderman. We'll see you next time, and shalom.